I'm Liam, 28, male, and my boss fired me for being too quiet. Not knowing my father had secretly left me 90% of the company. It was a mistake that would cost him everything he thought he had earned. He saw my silence as weakness, a fatal flaw in a world he believed belonged to the loud. He never once considered that the quietest person in the room is often the one who sees, hears, and understands the most. My father, Robert, was the founder of Keystone Construction. He was a man whose presence filled a room without him ever needing to raise his voice. He built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up, not with aggression, but with integrity, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to understand people. He understood me. Still waters run deep, Liam, he used to tell me, ruffling my hair as I sat poring over his blueprints as a kid. Don't ever let the noisy ones convince you that their volume equals value. He passed away a year ago, a sudden heart attack that felt like the world had tilted off its axis. In the aftermath, his second-in-command, Marcus Thorne, stepped into the CEO role. It was expected. Marcus was the opposite of my father in every way that mattered. Where my father was thoughtful, Marcus was impulsive. Where my father listened, Marcus broadcasted. He was all charisma and polished speeches. A man who loved the idea of leadership more than the actual practice of it. He had been my father's colleague for decades, but I always sensed a current of resentment in him. A jealousy that he masked with overly enthusiastic loyalty. My father had one last request for me before he died. He wanted me to work at the company for 6 years, starting from the very bottom, long before I ever saw a corner office. He wanted me to learn the sweat, the steel, and the soul of the business, so I did. I swept floors, I carried rebar. I learned project estimation from the grizzled veterans who had been with my dad since the beginning. For the last 2 years, I had been a junior project manager, a role that allowed me to see the inner workings of the company's biggest ventures. All the while, Marcus treated me like a curious pet, the founder's quiet, unassuming son who was clearly just there for a token job. The condescension was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my professional life. I remember one specific instance, about 6 months after my father was gone. We were in a budget meeting for a new commercial high-rise. Marcus was presenting a wildly optimistic timeline that I knew, from my time on the ground, was impossible without cutting major safety corners. I waited for a pause, and in the quietest, most respectful tone I could manage, I said, Mr. Thorne, the foundation pouring for a structure that size, especially with the predicted winter weather, will likely take 3 weeks longer than allocated. We might want to adjust the budget for overtime or amend the client's expectations. The room went silent. Marcus, who had been basking in the glow of his own presentation, slowly turned his head to me. He smiled, a tight, patronizing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Liam, he said, his voice dripping with false patience, thank you for that observation, but I think the senior team and I have a handle on the macro view. We'll leave the micro details to the foreman, shall we? He turned back to the board, and a few of his sycophants chuckled. I felt my face burn, not with embarrassment, but with a quiet, simmering anger. He hadn't addressed the point. He had dismissed the person my father would have asked why, and listened to the answer. Marcus only cared about who was speaking. Another time, at a company-wide town hall, Marcus was on stage, talking about his vision for a new era of aggressive growth. He spoke of needing lions and sharks in the company, people who would seize opportunities. He then made a show of pointing me out in the crowd. And we love having Liam here, he said into the microphone as if I were a charity case. He's a great example of the solid, steady foundation his father built, quiet, dependable. Every pride of lions needs a few gazelles, right? The laughter was scattered and uncomfortable, but it served its purpose. He had once again reinforced his narrative. I was not a leader, I was not a threat. I was just Robert's quiet son, a harmless relic of a bygone era. He had no idea that my father had been preparing me for this, not to be a lion, but to be the one who owned the entire jungle. The project that ended my career, or so Marcus thought, was the centerpiece of his aggressive growth strategy. It was called the Riverbend Complex, a massive mixed-use development that involved luxury condos, a retail plaza, and a public park, all on a tricky piece of land near the city's waterfront. It was ambitious, expensive, and incredibly high risk. Marcus had staked his reputation on it. He saw it as the project that would finally let him step out of my father's long shadow. For weeks, I had been buried in the project's logistics, cross-referencing architectural plans with supply chain reports and zoning regulations. My job was to flag potential issues before they became costly problems, and I found one. It wasn't a small detail, it was a foundational, multi-million-dollar error. The primary engineering firm had based their drainage and foundational load calculations on a geological survey that was 8 years old. A newer city commission survey, which was publicly available but had to be dug up, showed that the soil composition had changed significantly due to upstream dam alterations. The ground was softer, more saturated than the plans accounted for, building the proposed structure on that land without driving much deeper. More expensive pilings would be catastrophic in the long run. The foundation would shift, crack, and the entire structure would be compromised within a decade. I double-checked everything. I ran the numbers 3 times. I even anonymously consulted an old engineering professor of mine, who confirmed that it was a disaster waiting to happen. This was the kind of detail my father lived for, the quiet, hidden truth that could save the company from ruin. I knew I had to bring it to Marcus. I tried to approach him privately first. I sent him a polite, detailed email with the subject line, urgent, query on Riverbend geotechnical data. I attached both the old and new surveys and summarized the discrepancy in 3 clear, concise bullet points. I didn't want to embarrass him. I wanted to solve the problem. That was the Keystone way. My father's way. 2 days passed. No response. I saw him in the hallway, and he breezed right past me. With a big day tomorrow, Liam, Riverbend final approval meeting. He hadn't even read it. He was too caught up in the glamour of the final presentation to be bothered with inconvenient facts. The final approval meeting was held in the main boardroom, the one with the long mahogany table and the imposing portrait of my father on the wall. The room was packed with the senior leadership team, the lead architects, and even a representative from the client's side. The air was thick with anticipation. Marcus was in his element, pacing at the head of the table, his voice booming as he painted a picture of the glorious future the Riverbend complex would bring. He clicked through a slideshow of sleek, futuristic renderings. Everyone was nodding, captivated by his performance. As he reached his grand finale, he paused for dramatic effect. This project will define the next chapter of Keystone construction. It is bold, it is visionary, and it will be my legacy. Any final comments before we move to a formal vote of approval? My heart was pounding. This was my last chance. I knew he would hate being challenged in public, but the alternative, letting the company walk into a financial and structural disaster, was unthinkable. I raised a hand, a small, hesitant gesture. Marcus's eyes flicked to me, and a shadow of annoyance crossed his face. Liam, something to add? His tone implied I was interrupting the adults. I stood up, my legs feeling a little unsteady. My voice came out softer than I intended. Mr. Thorne, I just have a critical point of clarification regarding the foundational engineering. We have the best engineers in the city on this. Liam, he cut in, his voice sharp. I assure you, it's handled. I understand, sir, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. But I believe they may have been working from an outdated geological survey. A more recent city report indicates a significant change in soil saturation that isn't accounted for in the current plans. It could lead to severe foundational settling. The room became utterly still. The client representative frowned and started shuffling through his papers. The lead architect looked pale. I had hit a nerve. Marcus stared at me, his face a mask of cold fury. The charisma vanished, replaced by pure, undiluted rage. He felt undermined, exposed. He couldn't attack the data, so he attacked the messenger. To quiet, he suddenly boomed, pointing a finger at me. This is exactly what I'm talking about, a lack of confidence. You sit there quietly for weeks and then you try to derail a $1 billion project at the last second with some mumbled concern? That's not leadership, Liam, that's fear. I was stunned into silence. Sir, it's not fear. It's a fact. The data is, I've had it, he shouted, slamming his hand down on the mahogany table. The room jumped. I have spent the last year trying to inject some fire, some passion, some real leadership into this company. And all I get from you is this quiet, timid second guessing. You're just like your father in all the wrong ways, stuck in the weeds, afraid to take a risk. He took a deep, theatrical breath, his chest puffing out. He looked me right in the eye. You are too quiet to be a leader in my company. You don't have what it takes. You're fired. Get your things and get out. Security will escort you. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. He had fired me, in front of everyone. He had used my nature, the very quality my father taught me to value, as a weapon against me. The client looked horrified. The architect stared at the table. No one dared to meet my eyes. Humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. I simply nodded, turned around without another word, and walked out of the room, the stern, painted eyes of my father's portrait following me all the way. Walking back to my desk felt like moving through water. The open plan office, usually buzzing with a low hum of activity, seemed to fall silent as I passed. Heads popped up over monitors. Conversations died mid-sentence. The news of my public execution had clearly traveled faster than I had. People I had worked with for years, people I had shared lunches and project deadlines with, now stared with a mixture of pity and fear. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of Marcus's anger. I reached my small cubicle, a space I had occupied for 2 years. It was neat, organized, a reflection of my personality. There was a framed photo of me and my dad at a construction site when I was 10. Both of us wearing oversized hard hats and grinning. There was a small, thriving succulent that a colleague had given me. A stack of project files sat in a perfect, neat pile. It was my small corner of the world. And it had just been taken from me. My hands trembled slightly as I began to pack my belongings into a cardboard box. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. Marcus hadn't just fired me, he had tried to annihilate my sense of self-worth. He had declared, in front of the entire leadership, that my core being was incompatible with success, too quiet to be a leader. The words echoed in my head, a cruel and ringing pronouncement to security guards. Men I recognized from the lobby appeared at the end of the aisle. They looked deeply uncomfortable. One of them, a kind-faced older man named Frank, had known my father for 20 years. Liam, he said, his voice low and apologetic, we're really sorry. We've been told we have to, you know. I know, Frank, I said, managing a weak smile, just doing your job. I placed the photo of my dad in the box, face down. I couldn't bear to look at it right now. I felt like I had failed him. I had let a man like Marcus tear down a piece of the legacy he had built. As I unplugged my desk lamp, my work phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, a fellow project manager and one of the few people I considered a true friend at the company. He's a tyrant, Liam. What he did was disgusting. Don't let him get to you. The message was a tiny pinprick of light in a vast darkness. I texted back a quick thanks before powering the phone down and placing it on the desk. It was company property. Frank and the other guard escorted me to the elevator. The walk of shame, a silent, lonely procession. As the elevator door slid shut, I leaned against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes. The full force of the situation finally crashing down on me. I was jobless. I was humiliated. And the company my father had poured his life into was now in the hands of a reckless egomaniac who was about to drive it headfirst into a disaster. A wave of helpless anger surged through me. The elevator opened to the lobby, and I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, clutching my box of personal effects. The city noise seemed harsh and alien. I felt utterly adrift. I sat on a bench just outside the towering Keystone building, the glass and steel structure glinting in the sunlight, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. For about an hour, I just sat there watching the world go by, my mind a chaotic whirl of replays of the meeting. The smug look on Marcus's face, the shock on the client's, my own pathetic silence as I walked out. What would my father have done? He would have been calm. He would have been strategic. He would have known that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest. And then, a different memory of my father surfaced, cutting through the anger. It was from a few weeks before he died. He had looked tired, worried. He had told me, Liam, business is like a long game of chess. Some people only see the next move. They play with checkers, pieces loud, obvious, and all moving in the same direction. The real players, the ones who last, they see the whole board. They play with chess pieces. The quiet pawn can become the most powerful piece of all. Never forget that. My father didn't play checkers, he was a grandmaster. And it occurred to me that he must have known what kind of man Marcus was. He must have anticipated this. He wouldn't have left his life's work and his son completely unprotected. A name and a face swam into my mind. Evelyn Reed. She was our family's attorney. A woman as sharp and unyielding as tempered steel. My father had trusted her completely. She had handled his will, a document whose full contents were still a mystery to me. My father had stipulated that while some assets would be dealt with immediately, the final disposition of his corporate holdings would be sealed for 1 full year after his death. The 1-year anniversary had been last week. My hand went to my personal cell phone. My fingers were still trembling, but now with something other than humiliation. It was a flicker of something else, not quite hope, but a desperate, burning curiosity. I found her number in my contacts. I took a deep breath, stood up from the bench, and started walking, leaving the shadow of the Keystone building behind me. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and efficient as I remembered. Evelyn Reed speaking. Evelyn, it's Liam. Liam Hayes, I said, my own voice sounding distant. Liam, she said, and there was a warmth in her tone that I hadn't expected. I was wondering when you might call. I heard what happened at the office today. It's already making the rounds. He fired me, Evelyn, in front of everyone. I know, she said calmly, and in doing so, Marcus Thorne just made the biggest mistake of his life. Can you come to my office? There's something your father wanted you to see. It's time. Evelyn Reed's office was in an old, distinguished building downtown. The kind with marble floors and brass elevators. It smelled of old books and quiet power. Her office itself was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I had been there. With my father, dark wood floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a large window that looked out over the city. She wasn't seated behind her imposing desk, but in one of two leather armchairs near the window. A file, thick and bound in blue, sat on the small table between them. "Liam," she said, standing to greet me. She was a woman in her 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Please, sit. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you," I said, my voice still a little shaky. I sat down in the chair opposite her. The leather felt cool and solid, a comforting anchor in the storm of the day. "I am so sorry for what you went through today," she began, her gaze direct and full of sympathy. "Your father would have been furious, not at you, Liam, at Marcus. He would have been furious. But I don't think he would have been surprised." "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on top of the blue file. "Your father was a brilliant man. He was a master builder, not just of structures, but of plans. He saw people for who they truly were, their strengths and their weaknesses. He valued Marcus's drive and his salesmanship, but he was never blind to his ego and his recklessness." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That is why he structured his will the way he did. He created a test, a 1-year observation period. He wanted to see what Marcus would do when he had absolute, unchecked authority. He wanted to see how he would manage the company, and he wanted to see how he would treat you." My heart began to beat faster. This wasn't just a will, it was a final, intricate strategy from a man who saw the whole board. "Marcus has failed the test on every count," Evelyn continued, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "He has taken on reckless levels of debt, he has alienated key long-term employees, and he has treated you with contempt. Today's spectacle was merely the final piece of evidence." She slid the blue file across the table toward me. "This is the final executory instrument of your father's last will and testament. Its contents were sealed and legally bound from disclosure until the 1-year anniversary of his passing, which, as you know, was last Tuesday. Now it can be read and acted upon." I stared at the file. My name, Liam Robert Hayes, was typed neatly on the cover. My hands were clammy as I reached out and opened it. The document inside was dense with legal terminology, but Evelyn was there to guide me. "You can skip to Section C, Article 4, she said softly. "Ownership and voting shares of Keystone Construction, Inc." I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the formal language, and then I saw it. It was a simple paragraph, a few lines of text that held the weight of an empire. My eyes read it once, then twice, struggling to process the words. "I, Robert Hayes, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my controlling interest in Keystone Construction, Inc., comprising 90% of all voting shares, to my beloved son, Liam Robert Hayes, to be his, in perpetuity, 90%. The number didn't seem real. It was an abstraction, a figure so vast it was meaningless. I looked up at Evelyn, my mouth agape. 90? I whispered. She gave a small, firm nod. 90%. The remaining 10% is to be distributed among a list of 20 long-term employees, loyal people your father wanted to reward. Marcus Thorne's name is not on that list. His existing shares amount to less than 0.1%. Effectively, Liam, you are Keystone Construction as of this moment. Marcus Thorne works for you." I leaned back in the chair, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. The box of my belongings sitting by the door, the humiliating walk through the office, the sting of Marcus's words. It all seemed to warp and shift into a different shape. It was no longer a tragedy, it was an absurdity. He had fired his own boss. "Why?" I finally managed to ask. "Why would my father do it this way? Why not just tell me?" "Because he knew you," Evelyn said gently. "He knew you were not a man who craved power. He knew you would never have fought for it, and he knew that if you were named his heir immediately, Marcus and others would have suffocated you, tried to manipulate you, and never given you the chance to see the company from the inside, on your own terms. Your father didn't just give you his company, Liam. He gave you a year-long education in its strengths and weaknesses. With a front-row seat to its flawed interim leadership, he gave you the truth." She was right. For the past year, I had been an invisible observer. I had seen who was loyal and who was a sycophant. I had seen which projects were sound and which were vanity plays. I had seen the rot that Marcus's ego had introduced. My quietness, the very thing Marcus had used to discard me, had been my greatest tool. It had been my camouflage, allowing me to gather the intelligence I needed to lead. "My father also left you this," Evelyn said, handing me a sealed, personal envelope. My name was written on the front in his familiar, strong handwriting with trembling fingers. I broke the seal. The letter inside was short. My dearest Liam, if you are reading this, it means a year has passed. And you have no doubt seen things that have both proud and disappointed you. I am sorry I am not there to guide you through what comes next, but I have never doubted for a second that you are capable of doing it on your own. Your quiet nature is your greatest strength. It is not a weakness, it is a gift. It lets you see the details others miss and hear the truths others are too busy talking to notice. A leader's job is not to be the loudest person in the room, but the most thoughtful. It is to build, to protect, and to guide with wisdom, not with noise. Keystone is yours now. It is my life's work, but it is your future. Lead it with integrity, lead it with vision. Lead it in your own way. You are ready, you have always been ready. With all my love and pride, Dad. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words on the page. They weren't tears of sadness or humiliation anymore, they were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. My father had seen me, he had understood me completely. This entire, painful year had been his final, greatest lesson. He hadn't just left me a company. He had left me a validation of my very soul. I wiped my eyes and looked at Evelyn. The tremor in my hands was gone, the confusion in my mind was gone. In their place was a calm, cold clarity. What do we do now? I asked. My voice was different. It was still quiet, but it was steady. It was the voice of a man who knew his place. Evelyn smiled. A true, brilliant smile. Now, she said, we prepare you to take your seat at the head of the table. The next 7 days were a blur of intense, focused activity. It was a week that transformed me from a humiliated ex-employee into the rightful owner of a corporate empire. My grief and anger were channeled into a singular purpose. I didn't want petty revenge. I didn't want to storm into Marcus's office and yell, "You're fired," back at him. That was his playbook, not mine. I wanted to do what my father would have done, execute a flawless, strategic, and quiet assumption of power that would not only remove Marcus but also stabilize the company and set it on the right course. I practically lived in Evelyn Reed's conference room. We started at dawn and often worked late into the night. Fueled by coffee and a shared sense of mission, Evelyn was my general, my strategist, and my teacher. She brought in corporate governance specialists, financial analysts, and public relations experts. I was given a crash course and MBA in a week on the intricacies of running a company from the top. The first 2 days were spent on the legal framework. I had to understand the company's bylaws, the responsibilities of the majority shareholder, and the precise legal steps required to call an emergency board meeting and reconstitute its members. I pored over documents that would have put me to sleep a week earlier. But now I read every line with fierce concentration. I was no longer just Liam, the project manager. I was Liam Hayes, the 90% shareholder. The words on the page were no longer abstract rules. They were the tools I would use to reclaim my father's legacy. The key is to be unassailable, Evelyn stressed, tapping a thick legal binder. When we walk into that boardroom, our position must be so ironclad that any challenge would be laughable. No loopholes, no ambiguities. The next 3 days were a deep dive into the company's finances and operations. With Evelyn's legal authority as the executor of the will, we gained access to everything. We saw the true picture of what Marcus had done in his year as CEO. It was worse than I thought. He had leveraged company assets to fund high-risk, high-glamour projects like the Riverbend complex while neglecting the less exciting, but more profitable industrial and infrastructure contracts that had always been Keystone's bread and butter. He had replaced experienced, cautious department heads with his own yes men. The company was profitable on paper, but its foundation was rotting, much like the one he was planning to build at Riverbend. This was where my quiet years on the inside became my most valuable asset. I knew the projects he was neglecting. I knew the veteran employees he had sidelined. I could point to specific examples, matching names and numbers to the abstract financial data on the spreadsheets. He's running it like a casino, I said to the financial analyst, pointing at a cash flow statement. He's betting everything on one big, flashy win, and he's going to bankrupt us if he's wrong. The analyst, a sharp man named Mr. Chen, nodded grimly. You are correct. The level of exposure on the Riverbend project is alarming. Your father maintained a strict 30% liquidity reserve. Mr. Thorne has let it drop to less than 10%. My quiet anger hardened into cold resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the stability of this company. It was about the name, Keystone, that my father had built into a synonym for quality and trust. The final 2 days were spent on strategy and communication. How would we execute the takeover? When would we do it? I insisted it had to be at the next board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Monday. That's the stage he built for himself, I told Evelyn and the PR expert. It's the room where he humiliated me. It's only fitting that it's the room where the truth is revealed. We decided against any prior warning. The element of surprise was critical. We would walk in mid-meeting. Evelyn would present the legal documentation. And then, I would speak. We rehearsed it. I didn't want a script. But I needed to have my key points organized. My primary objective was to dismantle Marcus's flawed Riverbend plan. I spent an entire afternoon building a counter-proposal using the correct geological data. I outlined a revised, more stable, and ultimately more profitable version of the project. It would take longer and have a less spectacular, immediate profit margin. But it would be built to last and would protect the company's reputation and finances. I would not just be tearing down his leadership, I would be demonstrating a better alternative. My leadership. The hardest part was preparing for the confrontation itself. The PR expert, a calm and insightful woman named Maria, role-played Marcus with me. He will bluster, she said. He will try to intimidate you. He will call you weak. He will try to make it personal. You cannot let him draw you into that fight. Your power isn't in shouting back. It's in the facts. It's in the 90%. It's in your quiet confidence. On the last night, Sunday, I went home exhausted. I sat in my small apartment, the cardboard box of my old life still sitting by the door. I picked up the framed photo of my dad and me. I looked at our smiling faces. For the first time since my firing, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like his son. He had built the structure and now it was my turn to secure the foundation. I laid out my suit for the next day. It was one my father had bought me a few years ago. It was a simple, dark gray suit, a suit for a serious person. I wasn't going into that meeting as the quiet, timid Liam that Marcus had created in his own mind. I was going in as the man my father had raised me to be, the owner, the leader. The quiet storm that was about to break. Monday morning arrived, cool and clear. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. My reflection looked different. The uncertainty that had clouded my eyes for the past year was gone, replaced by a calm, focused intensity. I wasn't the same man who had been fired from this company a week ago. That man was gone, stripped away by the fire of humiliation and reforged by the knowledge of his father's unwavering faith. Evelyn and I met in the lobby of a coffee shop across the street from the Keystone building. She held a sleek leather briefcase, which contained the original, notarized documents of ownership. She gave me a reassuring nod. Ready, Liam? I am, I said, and the words felt true. We had timed our arrival perfectly. The weekly board meeting started at 10 a.m. We waited until 10:15. Allowing Marcus enough time to get comfortable, to get into the full flow of his self-aggrandizing performance. We crossed the street and walked into the lobby of the building. I had exited in disgrace just 7 days prior. The security guards at the front desk watched us with wide eyes. Frank, the guard who had escorted me out, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. We didn't need to sign in. We walked straight to the executive elevator and rode it up to the top floor. In silence, as we stepped out, the hushed, carpeted hallway felt like the calm before a storm. I could hear the faint, booming sound of Marcus's voice from behind the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom. I paused for a moment, took a deep breath and thought of my father's letter. Lead it in your own way. My way was not with a roar, but with resolve. I pushed the doors open. The room fell instantly silent. Every head turned towards us. Marcus was standing at the head of the table mid-sentence, a pointer in his hand aimed at a slide showing a glorious, impossible rendering of the Riverbend complex. His face, which had been animated and triumphant, went through a rapid series of emotions, first confusion, then irritation, and finally outright fury. What is the meaning of this? He snarled, his eyes locking onto me. I fired you. You have no right to be here. Security, that won't be necessary, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. She walked calmly to the table and placed her briefcase on its polished surface, snapping the locks open with 2 sharp clicks. Mr. Hayes is here at my request. She began to distribute copies of a single-page document to each of the 8 board members. This is a certified copy of the final executory instrument of Robert Hayes's will, specifically concerning the ownership of Keystone Construction's voting shares. The terms became effective last Tuesday. A confused murmur went through the room. The board members, all longtime executives who had respected my father but were now loyal to Marcus, looked down at the papers in their hands. I watched their faces as they read. I saw eyebrows raise. I saw jaws slacken. I saw one man, the CFO, slowly take off his glasses and rub his eyes in disbelief. Marcus hadn't received a copy. He stared, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. What is this nonsense, Evelyn? Robert left the company's management in my hands. He left the interim management in your hands, Evelyn corrected him coolly. A temporary stewardship. As you can all see from the document before you. Robert Hayes bequeathed 90% of the company's controlling shares to his son, Liam Hayes. The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Marcus looked as though he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked from the stunned faces of the board members to me, standing quietly by the door. His brain, so accustomed to a reality where he was the king, simply couldn't process this new information. That's not possible, he stammered. I assure you, it is, Evelyn said. It is legally unassailable. This was my moment. I walked forward, my footsteps a steady, measured beat on the plush carpet. I didn't look at Marcus. I looked at the board members. I looked at the portrait of my father on the wall. I walked all the way to the end of the long mahogany table, to the empty chair at its head, the CEO's chair. Marcus was still standing next to it, frozen. I gently pulled the chair out, turned it to face the room, and sat down. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. His face was a mixture of disbelief and pure hatred. The mask was gone. This was the real man, stripped of his power. You're fired, I said. The words were quiet, almost conversational. They were not shouted, they were not delivered with anger, they were a simple statement of fact. You can't do that, he sputtered, his voice cracking. I can, I replied, my tone even, and I have. However, let's talk about why. Please, sit down. Marcus, I gestured to a regular chair along the side of the table, humiliated. With the eyes of the entire room on him, he slowly, stiffly sat for the next 20 minutes. I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I presented the facts of his mismanagement with cold, quiet precision. I brought up the neglected industrial contracts. I detailed the alarming drop in the company's cash reserves, and then I turned to the Riverbend project. Marcus fired me because he claimed I was too quiet to be a leader, I said, addressing the board. The truth is, he fired me because I was listening, I was paying attention, and I discovered a fatal flaw in his legacy project using a remote I had brought with me. I turned on the projector and replaced his glossy rendering with the 2 geological surveys in a calm, clear voice. I explained the soil saturation issue and the catastrophic risk it posed. I presented the revised plan one had developed, the one that was safer, more secure, and ultimately better for the company. Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice, I said, my eyes scanning the faces of the people who had watched me get fired a week ago. It's about having the clearest vision. It's about protecting the company and its people. It's about building things that last. My father taught me that. The room was mine. The board members were nodding, not in sycophantic agreement, but with a dawning respect. They were seeing the son of Robert Hayes, not the quiet boy from the back of the room. Finally. I turned back to the broken man sitting on the sidelines. I said you were fired from your role as CEO, Marcus, and you are, however. I am not a man who believes in destroying people for sport. Your institutional knowledge, though clouded by ego, has some value. The company will offer you a position as a remote, non-management consultant for special projects. You will have no authority. You will have no team. You will report to the new head of project management. Your salary will be 1/4 of its current level. You can take it, or you can leave. The choice is yours. It was a perfectly crafted insult, a professional exile. It was far crueler than simply firing him. I was leaving him with a title, but stripping him of all the power and prestige he craved. He stared at me, his face pale, his lips trembling with a rage he could not express. He said nothing. He simply stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out of the boardroom without another word. A defeated man who had lost everything because he had underestimated the quiet man at the table. The doors swung shut behind him. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a silence of respect, of a new order settling into place. I looked around the room at the board members, at the company my father had built. All right, I said, my voice filling the room with quiet authority, let's get to work. The days and weeks that followed my ascension to the head of the table were a whirlwind of change. But it was a controlled, deliberate change. I didn't purge the company. I didn't rule by fear. I simply began to implement the principles my father had taught me: listen, understand, and build with integrity. My first act was to formally halt the Riverbend project as Marcus had envisioned it. In its place, I presented my revised, more stable plan. There were grumbles from the architects who loved the flashy design. But when I walked them and the engineers through the geological data, they understood. The grumbles turned into respect. We weren't just building a structure, we were building it right. Next, I sought out the veteran employees Marcus had sidelined. I had lunch with department heads he had demoted. I walked the construction sites and spoke with foremen he had ignored. I didn't make grand speeches, I asked questions. And I listened to the answers. I learned about the frustrations, the inefficiencies, and the brilliant ideas that had been suppressed under a regime that valued shouting over substance. One of the first people I promoted was Sarah, the project manager who had texted me after I was fired. I made her the new head of project management, the very position Marcus would now have to report to should he choose to accept his diminished role. He did, by the way. His ego was so vast that he couldn't bear to leave the company entirely, even if it meant being a ghost in the machine he once commanded. It was the most fitting punishment I could have devised. The culture of Keystone Construction began to shift. The loud, aggressive posturing that Marcus had encouraged began to fade. Meetings became shorter and more productive, because people were listening more than they were talking. We re-established our focus on the core industrial and infrastructure projects that were the company's bedrock, shoring up our finances and rebuilding the cash reserves Marcus had depleted. The lions and sharks he had tried to cultivate either adapted to the new, quieter way of doing things, or they quietly left, realizing that true strength wasn't about the size of your roar. The most challenging part was internalizing my new role. For so long, I had been the observer on the sidelines. Now, every major decision rested on my shoulders. There were nights I sat alone in my father's old office, now my office, looking at his portrait, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But then I would remember his letter, his quiet confidence in me. He hadn't expected me to be him, he had expected me to be me. My quietness became my signature, my brand of leadership. I didn't need to dominate conversations. I would sit in meetings, listen to all the perspectives, and then, at the end, I would summarize the key points, ask the critical questions, and outline a clear path forward. My words carried weight because they were measured and thoughtful. I learned that true authority doesn't come from a title or the volume of your voice. It comes from the trust you build and the wisdom you demonstrate. About 3 months in, the client from that fateful board meeting, the one where I was fired, requested a meeting with me. He was a powerful developer and his confidence in Keystone had been shaken. We sat in my office, and I walked him through all the changes we had made, showing him the new, safer plans for the Riverbend project and our renewed commitment to financial stability. When I was done, he leaned back and studied me for a long moment. You know, he said, I was in the room when Marcus Thorne fired you. I thought he was a fool then, and I know he's a fool now. Your father was a great man, Mr. Hayes. He would be very proud of you. Coming from him, that was worth more than any contract. We not only secured the revised Riverbend deal, but we became his exclusive construction partner for all future developments. My father built a company on a foundation of trust, and I was now rebuilding it, one block at a time. So, to anyone out there who has been told they are too quiet, or not aggressive enough, or that they don't have what it takes to lead, I want you to remember my story. The world is full of noise. It's easy to mistake volume for value and charisma for competence. But true strength often lies in the quiet spaces, in listening, in observing, in thinking before you speak. Your quiet nature is not a liability, it is a superpower. It allows you to see the whole board in a world full of people playing checkers. Don't ever let the loud ones convince you otherwise. Your time will come, and when it does, you won't need to shout. Your quiet confidence will be all the authority you need.